Well, you're watching Press TV's news review, where we look deeper into some of the top stories of the day. On this news review, Iran's ambassador to the United Nations says sanctions are inhumane and illegal measures which have consequences similar to those of terrorism and war crimes. Majid Takhtaravonchi said the consequences of sanctions are as brutal and criminal as those of terror and war crimes. He made the comments at a UN Security Council meeting on hunger and famine in conflicts. Iran's envoy said sanctions are one of the main causes of creating food insecurity. Takhtaravonchi also spoke about U.S. sanctions on Iran. He said the measures have hindered Iran's access to food, medicine, and medical equipment amid the pandemic. He also called for the immediate lifting of the ongoing siege on Yemen and the Gaza Strip. Joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have founder of Transnational.Live, Mr. Jan Oberg, who's joining us from Lund. Also, we have political analyst Jan Bosnitch joining us from New York. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Oberg. Jan, do you agree with the comments made by Mr. Majid Takhtaravonchi that sanctions they are inhumane and illegal measures equivalent to those of terrorism and war crimes?
Oh, yes. If you define terrorism as trying to achieve a political goal by harming, hitting, or killing innocent civilians and not combatants, which is a characteristic of terrorism versus warfare, that it deliberately hits innocent people who are not party to the conflict, then this is an act of terror. If you can prove, which we've already heard, that this is very hurtful for millions of people. I myself have seen sanctions applied on Serbia, Macedonia, on Iraq, where they killed more people in the sanctions over 13 years than in the warfare. And I've seen it in Syria, where they uphold it still. I mean, Syria is probably the second or third largest humanitarian catastrophe since 1945, and a completely destroyed country in at least parts of the country, but complete destruction where it has been destroyed, such as eastern Aleppo. And I'm appalled by the fact, and I'm ashamed of the fact that this is done to innocent people. I think it's right to say that. And I'm very glad, finally, to see that 16 countries have today announced that they formed a group of friends in support of the UN Charter, because this behavior has nothing to do with international law and it's against the letter and spirit of the UN Charter.
Mr. Bosnitch, your thoughts on the issue. Do you agree with Mr. Oberg, who doubled up on the comments made by Iran's ambassador to the United Nations? Sanctions, specifically during the global pandemic that we're experiencing right now, are equivalent to terrorism and war crimes and are a collective punishment.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say I'm very happy to be on this program with Jan Oberg, whose work I've been following and reading with great agreement. I would like to say that the foundation of a peaceful world was meant to be formed through the United Nations, through the World Trade Organization, through free trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement. And these institutions are all jeopardized by unilateral sanctions. All of these institutions indicate that sanctions, unilateral sanctions especially, are a violation of the concept of multilateral peaceful interaction between states. So I would like to not use the word that sanctions are equivalent to terrorism. I would like to just say sanctions are terrorism. It's not an equivalency. It is a form of terrorism, and terrorism is a form of war. And so we have 4 steps if we want to achieve a war, if that's what our objective is. First, we have a false history. We present the story about, let's say, Iran as a false history. All of the historical facts about Iran are not made available to the people of North America. I'm here in New York. I can tell you there's nothing truthful being circulated in the media here about Iran, about Iran's history, about Iran's contributions to the world. Nothing, not a word. Second, you introduce contemporary propaganda and hate literature against the state. blaming them for everything you can possibly blame them for, to instill a new modern hatred against them, because it's always easier to kill somebody who you've previously demonized. Third, you introduce trade and economic sanctions. And since the rest of the world is against war generally, because the economies of most of the countries of the world are not based on the war machine or the military-industrial complex, you have to do it unilaterally if you're in the United States, because other people will not go along with it. The EU did not want to go along with sanctions against Iran or against Russia or against China, because they have to trade with them to keep their people at work. And finally, the last aspect of this third element of war, sanctions, is to try and turn the people of a nation against their own government, to cause them to participate in a coup d'etat in which infiltrators sent by the United States lead a civil uprising or unrest against their state. And if that does not bring the state down, it destabilizes the target state enough so that a quick war against them can be successful. So these are the 4 steps to war: false history, propaganda, sanctions, and then outright war. And that's where we are now. We have a unilateralist system being propagated by the United States in direct contravention of all of the international norms of multilateral cooperation. And I can tell you, the chickens are going to come home to roost on this one, because the United States has an economy which, if it does produce something for sale, it has to be sold around the world. And they simply will not have any markets left if they close those markets by putting sanctions on target countries. So they will be hurting themselves, and their empire, which is dependent on trade controlled by military distribution lines, will fall. So they will be scoring the biggest own goal in modern history.
Mr. Oberg, in Lund, Iran's Mr. Avanchi also spoke about the U.S. sanctions as we've been focusing on right now. He said the measures have hindered Iran's access to food, medicine, medical equipment amid the pandemic. Don't you think at this specific time right now, where the world is suffering globally, there should be some form of a collective pressure to get the United States to remove these sanctions or alleviate the pressure when the world is at a challenging time like the pandemic that we're in right now?
Oh, definitely. I've argued for years that we need a civil disobedience campaign among NATO countries and everywhere else against the US empire and its net, very destructive impact on the rest of the world. And actually, having never been an anti-American, which would be absurd, I must say, I think Mr. Bosnitch's wonderful, elegant 4 points are totally to the point, I would say, as a peace researcher, conflict and war scholar, and this is hurtful to the US and the Western world itself. And I don't understand why NATO allies in Europe, which are, if anybody will be listened to in Washington, it would be the allies, that they are lying flat, both in NATO and the European Union. Unless there's a counter pressure, and that's what we call dialectics, I think, well, anyhow, in the longer or shorter perspective, the US empire will fall. It's obviously declining and about to fall. But I would like that to be a peaceful fall. And that means political pressure, diplomatic work, civil disobedience, no longer taking orders from Washington. The secondary sanctions in Europe is disgusting to me. They do hit also humanitarian assistance from European countries to Iran. And therefore, as I said in the beginning, I'm very happy to see that there are 16 countries led by Russia and China who today have declared that they will be the friends of the Charter, because the world has to come back to international law and to the UN Charter, which is the most important and most Gandhian document governments have ever signed. We cannot survive in this world if we let a little group of countries, particularly the US, violate on a daily basis the norms and provisions and the letters of the UN Charter and international law. The fact that your country is hit by it is only one among many. It's bad, but it's many other countries that are hit by these violations, such as Syria has been too, in a more brutal way. And I'm appalled by the fact that Biden promised that he would come up with a new way of getting Iran engaged and the JCPOA on the table again. And then what he does is nothing but standing on the shoulders of Trump's policies, which was to withdraw from it. If Biden was an honest and decent person, he would long ago have said, without conditions, we are getting back to and entering again the JCPOA, and from there we might discuss certain things. But saying we're not going to do that before Iran does this or that is appalling to me, given that he promised that he had some ideas that were better than Trump. He's even worse than Trump in this case.
All right, thanks a lot, gentlemen. The founder of Transnational.Live, Jan Oberg, joining us from Lund. Also, thanks to political analyst John Bosnitch joining us from New York. With that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review.